Hey kids, so my son yesterday during his birthday party found out that his strep test from Friday that was originally negative was actually positive. Happy birthday! So I'm home with him today. So what's going to happen today is that I have made a video for the counter argument lesson. You are to watch it and go through it individually, pausing at each step. So what I will do is I will explain a step of the outline. You will watch my video, you will pause it, you will write that. Once you feel like you've written it well, if you want to ask any of the other teachers in the room to check it or any peer to check it, you can. And then you unpause the video and move on to the next step. There are 5 steps total. When and if you don't finish this during class, then finishing the counter argument is your homework. If you do finish it during class, then what I'd like you to spend the rest of the time doing is continuing to work on the IXL diagnostic, especially if you're someone who has not gotten to a solid number in any of those areas on the diagnostic. Again, if you don't get there, that's fine. The only goal that you need to do for today is the counter argument, and that video is going to start right now. All right, so we're going to do counter argument and rebuttal today. So the way that this is written in your outline is as a single paragraph, but as you get into writing it today, if you find, dude, this paragraph is going like crazy long, you can break it into 2 paragraphs between the counterclaim section and the rebuttal. So that would be between steps 2 and 3. All right, so let's get started. Step 1 is to state the counterclaim. So this is just going to be a single sentence. And you have 2 options of what it can be. I think the simplest way to go is for it to be an opposing theory. So, for example, I was writing about if my whole argument is that the Alcatraz inmates escaped, my counterclaim would be, on the other hand, some people say that they died. It could be that straightforward of just like what could somebody else argue is a solution to this mystery. So my example on the right-hand side is one of those. I could say, on the other hand, many historians believe that the settlers in the Roanoke settlement had a far more sinister relationship with the local native tribes and were actually raided and killed during their 3 years of isolation. So that's an example of this first type of option. The second type of option I think is a little bit more challenging, but it might work well for some of you, which is this can be a common reason why researchers think your solution is unlikely, but it has to be one that you haven't already addressed in your reasoning. So you can't just expand on one that you kind of touched on in your reasoning. This needs to be a new idea. Either way, whichever one you choose, it needs to start with one of these common counterclaim sentence starters. So, on the other hand, or others will claim that, or others have suggested that, or contradictorily, some people believe. And the reason why you need to put this is because if you don't, it looks like you had a personality shift midway through the essay. It sounds like you went from being like, they died, they lived. And that is very jarring. You need to make it clear that this is not your opinion. This is the opinion somebody else might have to contradict you. So at this time, pause this video and go ahead and work on step 1. All right, moving on to step 2. Now that you've written your counterclaim statement, you need to support this counterclaim. And this is kind of weird because you're going to take a minute to actually explain why somebody that disagrees with you, why they might believe the way that they believe. And so you can't just go, here's what other people believe, but they're stupid. You have to actually explain why they have some credibility in believing that. And this should be at least 4 sentences, and basically it includes both evidence and reasoning. You're treating the counterclaim as legitimate, meaning that you need to explain why people believe this other side and give some evidence and reasoning for their perspective. You're treating it like, hey, it could be the option. You can take evidence from your group note-taking document. Remember, you took notes on various different possible solutions to this mystery. You can even ask a peer, hey, you had a different claim and thesis than I did. What's one of the pieces of evidence that you used that you thought was the strongest? Or you can conduct further research. Any of those things or a combination of them are fine. And just as a reminder, you're not agreeing with your counterclaim. Remember that your whole essay is on the other side, and you're actually just presenting this counterclaim as like a setup so that you can knock it down with the rebuttal. But you do have to, for at least 4 sentences here, explain why that perspective has some merit, because of course it does. So here's my example. In my counterclaim that some people say that the people at Roanoke were killed by the Native Americans, I'm going to say this to support that. After all, this argument is in many ways ostensibly the most logical. Throughout the entire period of European colonization, white settlers clashed, often violently, with native peoples. According to a true declaration of the state of the colony of Virginia, a document published in 1610 that detailed the struggles that early settlers at Jamestown faced, this follow-up colony to the failed Roanoke was frequently besieged by local native tribes. The account describes how settlers were lured from their encampment under the promise of peace talks, only for dozens of them to be killed. It also claims that constant attacks made settlers afraid to leave the fort and that 600 of their hogs were slaughtered by native raiding parties. The hostilities, so that's all evidence. And then at the end here, I'm going to kind of give a little bit of reasoning. The hostility between the colonizers and the natives at Jamestown was hardly an anomaly in the New World either, and it is not a far leap to imagine that the settlers of Roanoke were less lucky in their ability to hold off those attacks. So again, I've done the same thing that I did in one of my body paragraphs where I use an example of a different colony to make the point about what the people at Roanoke must have experienced. But again, I'm still supporting my counterclaim. And as a reminder, this is not what I believe. I'm just setting up what other people might say. So go ahead and pause here, take some time to develop and write that counterclaim. All right, step 3, we're back to single sentences. So for this one, for your rebuttal, now is the time to knock down that counterclaim that you took so much time setting up. And honestly, the more effort that you put into writing the counterclaim, the more impressive it will be when you provide a rebuttal that knocks it down. So your rebuttal statement is a single sentence, and this is going to start with some sort of transitional word that suggests, yeah, I know I just told you that thing, but I'm about to start disagreeing with it and tearing it apart here. So phrases, it could be however, that being said, while that makes some sense, on the other hand. And if you look at my example on the right, it says, however, while one can see why some people believe that the settlers at Roanoke met a bloody end. So I'm like, I get why you would believe that, but here's the answer. The way that the settlement looked when John Wright returned far from resembled a battlefield or a graveyard. So what I'm saying is, yeah, that makes sense that you might have thought they were violent. There was a violent kind of relationship in some ways, but the way that the settlement looked does not connect with that. And so that's my rebuttal statement. Single sentence that provides a reason why the counterclaim that you provided can't be true. Don't remember, just like we talked about with your claims and your body paragraphs, you don't want to get to the evidence yet. You're going to get to that in the next step. You're just kind of creating a claim that rebuttals the counterclaim. And also make sure that you aren't repeating your body paragraph points. This should be something new. This is a new idea. And it needs to be connected to the counterclaim. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes I'm a vegetarian. If I were going to write an essay about why you should be a vegetarian, my counter argument might be, well, some people say meat is delicious. Well, I can't rebuttal that by being like, but it's cruel. It can be cruel and delicious. Saying it's cruel doesn't actually rebut the statement of it's delicious. However, I could say, yes, it's delicious, but there are meat replacements that taste just as good. That is a rebuttal statement that connects to the counterclaim. This is where I see people mess up the most. They give a rebuttal statement that is important, but it's not really connected to the counterclaim. And this rebuttal statement has to be directly connected to the counterclaim that you provided in step 1. It needs to be on the same topic. All right, so take a pause here, use my model, write your rebuttal statement, and then we'll move on to step 4. Okay, step 4, this is the support and reasoning for your rebuttal. This should be the longest part of your paragraph. It should be at least 4 sentences. It needs to include both evidence and reasoning, and it should support your rebuttal. You do not want to repeat evidence from your body paragraphs here. So if you find yourself doing that then it might be because your rebuttal statement was too similar to one of your claims in your body paragraphs. And you want to draw connections back to your counterclaim, explaining both how this evidence supports your rebuttal statement, but also how it proves that the counterclaim cannot possibly be true. This will be most successful if you use if-thens here. This is a great place for that. So let's look at my example. White's own journal describes the experience of returning to the settlement. In his report, he does not describe the fort as seeming to be the scene of any struggle, and seems convinced that the settlers moved to modern-day Hatteras Island. He does not report violent destruction of any remaining objects other than what 3 years of exposure to the elements would do, reporting that damaged objects are, quote, rotten and spoiled with rain. He describes the houses as taken down, not burned or destroyed. White's use of the term taken down suggests that they were intentionally disassembled, as though they were moved as the colony migrated. When talking about finding the famous Croatan carved on a nearby tree, he mentions that this had been their plan all along, to retreat to another location if their current location became untenable. He even reports that they had a plan to indicate the presence of danger or violence. If they were moved by force, the settlers were to carve a cross onto the tree along with their location. He writes that no cross is present, indicating, at least for him, that no murder or war had befallen his family, including his 3-year-old granddaughter. Lastly, perhaps the most convincing counter-argument to counter the suggestion that the colonists were murdered is that White does not report seeing any bones or bodies. It is highly unlikely that if the settlers did succumb to violence from native people, their attackers would have taken the time to bury them or dispose of 110 bodies. And no excavations of the area in modern times have ever given historians any evidence of a mass grave. So, I used a lot of evidence there. I think you could achieve the exact same thing in about half the time if you used about half the evidence, but that is an example of how you can thoroughly provide evidence for your rebuttal. And I've kind of analyzed it and given reasoning as I've provided it. So go ahead and pause here, use my thing as a model. You might have to go back and find evidence or go do some additional research for this, but this is your support and reasoning for your rebuttal statement. And we'll wrap it up in slide 5. All right, step 5, the wrap up. This is a single sentence, wraps up everything that you've said in this paragraph. It's kind of like what you've been doing at the end of your reasoning in your body paragraphs. Think of it like a summary that connects back to the overall thesis of your whole essay. Think about the keywords from both this paragraph and the thesis that are going to need to show up here to keep your argument focused. So my example is, without the presence of such evidence, it seems far more likely that the settlers at Roanoke found refuge with the local Croatan tribe, a tribe which even White, a desperate father and grandfather whose family was nowhere to be found, described as, quote, our friends. So I'm just connecting it back to that idea that they weren't killed by the Native Americans. They actually went and lived with them, which is, of course, my thesis. So one sentence of wrap up here and you will be done, friends. When you finish writing that, again, if you are still within the class period and you have time left, you should work on the IXL diagnostic. If you are at home, this is homework. I hope you finished it, and we will work on our introductory paragraphs tomorrow. Thank you, friends.